So good afternoon again. Hope you've had a very good lunch. So we've had some very fantastic sessions in the morning, and now we are starting our afternoon session. And before I invite the speaker and introduce him, I'd like to make a small announcement here. And I think most of you or some of you may like to use the wireless. So we've got the network written over here. The network is all capital letters, ANU-access/ANU-secure. The password, the username is unihouseconf, just one word, all lowercase. And then we've got the password as London14, and both the O's are capital in that. If you're not able to read this, I can repeat this again, but if not, please feel free to use the network to access internet. So that brings me to the afternoon session. And it's a privilege for me to welcome Malcolm. There he is. Malcolm and I have worked together for almost 10 years. I've known him for the past 10 years at the University of Western Australia. And I can say that he's one of the most committed persons I have ever met for fostering the values of equity and diversity. Extremely committed to changing attitudes of people towards diversity. He very beautifully unpacks the concepts of privilege, gender, race, and especially now with the initiative for Courageous Conversations. I'm not sure if you had the opportunity to participate in Courageous Conversations, but that's another great initiative which he's part of, and not only at UWA but across different universities in Australia and I think internationally as well. He's giving a lot of opportunity to people to participate in these courageous conversations. So something about the session today, it is a very interactive session. We'll have some information presented by Malcolm, but then we will also have a lot of interactive session, and he has requested that all of you please participate. Jump in and participate because that is the value of this particular session. Malcolm currently is the Associate Director of Equity and Diversity at UWA. With more than 20 years of experience behind him, and I'm sure you'll be touched by the session that we're going to have now. With those few words, I'd like to welcome Malcolm, and on behalf of ICRA, it's a privilege for us to host this session and also sponsor the workshop. Thank you. Malcolm.
Thanks very much, Remy. This is a really difficult slot because it's the graveyard slot after lunch. And most people have had a great lunch, you're kind of dozing off. So I was worried when I got the slot. The good side is I've been very warmly welcomed. I've had so many people say, we heard you last year, it was fantastic. Really looking forward to it. Many of you have sent me emails. So I feel a bit like Lady Gaga. So, I've already got an established groupie, so I'll be fine. Okay, so I'd like to acknowledge ICRA, obviously, for sponsoring the session, and I feel very heartened being here because, you know, hitting a number of points. I've been in the equal opportunity and diversity sector for over 20 years in Australia, and in many ways, I work collaboratively very closely with the US, and the US and particularly Canada are way, way, way ahead of us on so many of these dimensions. And it was fantastic this morning to hear a Vietnamese Australian and a lesbian voice at a mainstream conference, giving 30 minutes airtime. I think that's absolutely fantastic. Even 5 years ago, that would not have happened at an Australian diversity conference. A much more layered analysis of the issues as well. And I think it's great to see that a mainstream organization, science is your core business, and you are taking organizational culture, valuing people, valuing diversity, affirming potential seriously. So 2 days away. So I think I really want to commend your sector. It's not just one of, I've got a colleague, Sybil, and a few other people from equity. It's not just us equity and diversity people getting together and banging our heads against a brick wall. It's great to see it getting into the mainstream, getting traction into the mainstream. So I'm really heartened by this conversation. Where I want to go today, I just think despite the obvious disadvantages of being in the post-lunch slot, the great thing is I think it could not have beautiful synchronicity in terms of the speakers. So you had a global view from the minister, you had the statistics, you had two deeply personal and very generous stories, you had Gillian providing an academic lens on the area, and I'm now going to come into these two dimensions. So Joan Acker is a gender theorist, and when organizations like yourself engage in the process of critical self-reflection, Acker recommends you look at 4 key dimensions. The structural, that's the architecture of the organization. Cultural, what is the culture like? When you put the thermometer in the water, what does it feel like for somebody who may be trans, or a person of color, or a person with a mental health condition? But the area that we often don't look at is the personal and the interpersonal. And Parker Palmer, who is a very distinguished educator, says often in education we look at the why, the when, the how, the mechanics of education. We rarely look at who am I. So what I'm going to do for the next hour and a half is focus very much on a very interior conversation, a reflective interior conversation in that personal and interpersonal quadrant. So Lao Tzu says, the fish is the last one to know what water is. And obviously in our area, quite often we're swimming in it, and I think Lisa's story gave you a unique insight of what it meant to be LGBTI and what LGBTI inclusion means for her working at Zara. So obviously UWA strives for all of us to be citizens of the globe, and all our universities have those aspirations. I want to unpack citizens of the globe. By that I mean both intellectually and emotionally comfortable with difference. A lot of people get difference intellectually, so we all support this. Respect, dignity, diversity, inclusion, fairness, etc. Often people don't get it emotionally. So when you're hitting up against somebody with an accent who you had, going back to your slide, Min, had positioned as a quiet, compliant Asian academic, and the Asian academic calls you out, as a case I dealt with recently in the university sector, and I'll explain that in a minute. Then you're targeted emotionally. So do you respond in a diversity-friendly way, or do you get defensive? Okay, and I'll give you the example, because I think stories are very powerful. Now, as Renu said, obviously this is confidentiality. My examples, I want to stress, are not just UWA. They may be any university, okay? So I just want to stress that up front. So the example was, I mediate a lot of racial harassment cases. So an academic, an associate professor, let's just say Southeast Asian Australian, relatively recently arrived. So unlike Min, had a stronger accent, perfect English, stronger accent. We had poached her from in an eminent university. And so things were going well for about 7 months, and there were a few cultural stressors. And so the complainant approached me, and the dean asked me to intervene. I always believe in having conversations. I think that's so critical, rather than waiving the policy and procedure book first. So I went out with the head of school, a senior white female, and mapped out what's called the bamboo ceiling. So currently there's a lot of research in an Australian context around what's called the bamboo ceiling. So very similar to the glass ceiling, and this is now just slipping into the Australian discourse, which is fantastic. So it's taking the conversation to a much more sophisticated level. Our human rights commissioner, Dr. Sue Thomasani, talked about the bamboo ceiling for the first time 2 months ago. And it's a combination of those factors. So it's accent. Australia is one of the most monolingual countries in the world. So obviously, we're not going to be rude if someone has an accent. But for the most part, we don't really want to hang out with them socially, or perhaps have them in our teams, or invite them to the university club where promotions or deals may get done. Skin color and the attributions we make to skin color. So when you have accent and skin color, they create what's called cultural distance. So who's the fit for the organization? So fit can be very explicit, or it can be very subtle. And diversity research shows, for the most part, we invite people of difference into our organizations. We expect them to change. We very rarely look self-critically, which is why I'm delighted at this body. We extremely rarely look self-critically at ourselves and our organizations. Low racial consciousness. So when you've got a critical mass of staff who are in low racial consciousness and don't get race, so they either go into what Gilad right here last June said. She said, I'm not saying my gender had everything to do with it, but neither did it have nothing to do with it. So I'm inviting you to remain in that Gilad gray space. And we often go for the low-hanging fruit. Either, oh, it's got nothing to do with race, they've got a chip on their shoulder, they're a challenge, they're troublesome, they're problem makers, or they make everything race. So we go into one of those two binaries without realizing it's much more nuanced and layered than that. And the lack of cultural competence. So those factors combine to create the Bangalore sitting. So I went through it with her. She warmly held my hand and said, thank you, Malcolm, for giving me an insight. I, as a white woman, hadn't seen this, the fish and water stuff, the first slide that I put up. And so I went back to the Southeast Asian academic and said, great meeting, great humility. She was very open. She, walked in your shoes. I think we can now proceed to constructive mediation, blah, blah, blah. So next day I get a call from someone very senior asking to see me. So I saw them, and the head of school had lodged a formal complaint that I had called her a racist. So that's the issue. So that's what Walid Ali calls about the daily acts of unconscious racism. Okay? And I think you had a beautiful word, Lee, micro inequities. I call it microaggressions. So often it's under the radar and it's not seen. Okay, so that's the sort of stuff. So regrettably, had she been open, we could have very likely got to an amicable solution very quickly. The result was it ended up, it's fine now. The result was it ended up being a two-layered complaint process. So the Southeast Asian academic against her against me, and it was a bit of a dog's breakfast for a while, simply because she chose to be defensive. So it was very sad. So essentially, so that's what I mean by emotionally comfortable with difference. Okay, so she got it, absolutely. I was doing the right thing by this person. I poached her. I thought she was great, but she's not cutting the mustard, etc., etc. And I absolutely acknowledge there may have been some performance issues, but it was definitely heavily imbued with cultural issues. Okay, and it's what the frightening thing is. This particular individual is heading up an incredibly multicultural school in one of our most diverse faculties in universities. So go figure. And I would say the level of racial consciousness incredibly low. So I'm just going to do this a bit organically because we had a beautiful conversation before lunch. So I'm not going to stick in a linear way to my slides, but I'll give you a broad E&D landscape so in an Australian context, we had the legislation. So pretty much for most of the 90s and noughties, people have stayed in policy and legislation, etc. At UWA, we decided in the early noughties to move away from that. We felt we had done the structural stuff really well. We focused very much on those three dimensions. So we began with the Ally program, courageous conversations about race, inclusive campus culture. So I, for example, would go out, about 60 times a year to various areas on campus to have these sorts of conversations. And there's been a dramatic shift in the discourse and in the dialogue. So very senior males like Brian at UWA are now talking white privilege. So when they gave the address on Harmony Day, they're talking white privilege, acknowledging their own white privilege and what it means for a truly inclusive campus. Okay, so that's the difference where I believe organizations need to go. You need to have these conversations. The second piece I think that's missing is executive engagement. So generally, very committed middle managers like Renew, people like yourselves on the ground, the lasers, the mins in the field, get it. And that's one part of the equation. There's a very eminent, or was, I should say, she's regrettably passed away, Joan Eveline. And Joan talks about leading from the basement. So she said, don't always focus on senior people, because you can actually build an army and you can lead significant cultural change from the basement. That's all very well and good, but you absolutely need executive engagement. And for the most part, there have only been 2 vice-chancellors that have attended a courageous conversation about race. I go around the country, so Edith Cowan and Unitec Auckland. At most other universities where I've been a guest, a senior practitioner in the area, the highest level I've got is probably a PVC, if that, but generally a dean or 2. So there isn't enough executive engagement. And the third key area is we have absolutely had a very strong focus on gender, and rightly so, and there's a long way to go. I think it is also important to look at other areas, and certainly one of the critiques many women of diversity say is they sometimes feel invisible in the gender debate. So it's about gender, but beyond gender. It's about race, and you can't just limit race as indigenous. It's about culturally diverse. It's about the refugee experience. It's about the first and second generation experience, and it's about whiteness and white power. And it's about LGBTI. So I'm delighted to see LGBTI inclusion creeping in the last 4 years. It was completely invisible for the first 2 decades post the enactment of legislation. So that's the broad E&D landscape. These are difficult and challenging organizations. I don't want to get into cherry picking and setting up identity politics, that gender is more important than race, which is more important than LGBTI. These are conversations that you need to have in your organization in terms of where you want to place your priorities. But I would say at least one priority in each of the identity categories, and then one cutting across all of them. So the first one, we've talked about the notion of diversity and intersectionality, gender, sexual orientation, race. It's a layered experience. So my experience as an Asian Australian is different to Min's. My experience as an Indian Australian, being born in Goa and growing up Portuguese Catholic, very different to Renu, who's North Indian and Hindu. Okay, so again, many layers. So you can't just lump us in the Indian category, even though we're both first generation immigrants, came here in our late teens. Okay, so and the 2 lenses I want to look at, so again, going into that interior journey, is this notion of privilege. So how do we make an assessment of privilege? This is a very important one. People can often say, look, it's all fine here. We've got the United Nations. We've never had a race-based complaint. By and large, there may be a little skirmish here and there, but we are a happy, harmonious Australia. Yes, we are. We have done some very good stuff, but I don't think you can stay in Pollyanna. That's a very dangerous place to be, because there are ongoing and daily microaggressions towards Indigenous people, towards women, towards people of color, and towards LGBTI people. Okay? And privilege and power is a critical lens to look at. So Lisa said she's had a relatively good run. The bottom line is you've got to look at it through how close is the person to the seat of power. So if you are first generation immigrant with a dark skin, relatively recently arrived with a stronger accent, you're quite far removed to the core of white privilege. So you're likely to hit up a lot more unconscious bias bubbles, which may impede structurally. If you're a very effeminate, queenie gay man, you're much more likely to hit up a lot more unconscious bias around LGBTI issues, or if you're a very, very butch lesbian. Okay, let's make no mistake about that. If you can pass, or if you're relatively close, you're likely to have a much smoother run. So yes, we may have lovely stories about children not seeing it, and it's all wonderful, and I acknowledge all those stories. The bottom line is there is also significant discrimination in schoolyards when a very effeminate boy or a very butch girl, the manifestation of gender identity starts coming forth. So it's important in all of these things to stay in that Gillard grey space. So for example, when I go through LAX, and say Brian goes through LAX, so Brian may get pulled over and think, oh well. With me, I'm thinking, was it because I look Indian Pakistani? Or was it simply a random, they picked passenger 1, 3, 9, 16, 17, and I was passenger 17. Okay, that's the Gillard grey space. So I think with diversity, and when you're looking at addressing diversity, both at a cultural level and at a personal level, you've got to take a layered analysis of the issue. And the second area is the area of unconscious bias, and it's, people have touched on it before. Very simple example, you know, property prices are crazy. So a very good friend of mine knows what I stand for, knows that I've been an anti-racist practitioner for a very long time. He's just bought a house in Northbridge and said he wanted to pay $650,000, so he ended up paying $685,000. And he said, oh, Malcolm, it's those bloody Asians, they're pushing the property market up. You know, and that's the unconscious bias. So it's there in all of us, it creeps up. And the challenge is, how do you feel it? How do you go into mindfulness? How do you recognize it? And how do you then challenge it? So I've had to watch male unconscious bias. In equity, I work primarily in female teams. So how do you become mindful of how male unconscious bias can emanate in that space? Okay? So the first area we're going to look at is so how unconscious bias manifests in work. I think Gillian's presentation and the minister's presentation covered pretty much how the resumes, the levels of recommendation. A great study. Similar, you might want to comment on this. The New York, was it the New York Philharmonic Orchestra? Yeah. So what happened was they noticed there was a very low number of women who were successful at the orchestra. So what they did was they put a screen and they got the panel of judges to assess both men and women, and they asked the women to wear flat shoes. So you couldn't hear heels on the stage. After the first time they did it, the number of women approximated 50, and in the last 3 years it has exceeded 50. So very clear example of unconscious bias. And the important thing to remember is it's not just the blokes who are unconscious bias. Women can have unconscious bias as well. Because when society is feeding you messages about Napoleonic and masculine leadership, women internalize that as well. When society is feeding you messages about whiteness and white privilege, people of color internalize that as well. Okay? And there was an interesting conversation earlier about Asian Australians, and I'll come to that in the other piece, as to why it's difficult to collect data for migrant and Asian Australians. I'll explain that in a second. So it's quite simply, it's complex psychological theory that basically internalized sexism, racism, homophobia. So when you're in a society and you've been historically an oppressed group in terms of sharing power, resources, decision making, etc., you can go either two ways. You can either get how it works, get savvy, and then build communities of support and what's called, the sisterhood, build communities of support and networks to address it and mobilize, or you can align with the dominant group and take on the values of the dominant group, okay? Because that often allows you access to power. So for example, if you're second generation Asian, you're slipped under the radar, you align with the dominant group, and so basically that head of school said, see, I've got a Filipino Australian, I've got an Indian Australian, Sri Lankan Australian, they're all fine. It's just that Southeast Asian academic was the problem. So basically, when all those three were secretly colluding with her and saying there isn't a culture of inclusion, but were absolutely terrified to come out and say it. So that's the difference, okay? So that's how the internalized process works. So with gender, I'm just going to put up the stats. You've seen them all through the morning. I'm not going to labor the point. Okay, and health and the social services much lower paid compared to mining. So you see how that plays out. Higher education, preponderance of women in professional staff, but not at level 10 and above. So it becomes very gendered. The professoriate, Gillian's slides before, there's a group of 8, and senior lecturers. Okay, so Catherine Fox talks about the 7 deadly sins, and this really spoke to me. She came out to UWA last year. She said we're all very guilty of these. The first thing, we believe it's a meritocracy. So the Philharmonic Orchestra said, well, we're all equal. So we don't put selection panels through unconscious bias training. So we believe it's a level playing field. That's the first thing. The gender pay gap is exaggerated. It's a number that's inflated by the female lobby to push for greater gender equity, when in reality it exists. 17.8 nationally, or it's a 22 nationally and 17.8 for Western Australia, one or the other. Women with children lack ambition, act more like men, so it's very much you've got to toughen up. The Margaret Thatcher syndrome. Quotas and targets are a bad idea. I'm strongly for targets. I think targets is the only way. So the Nordic countries, legislated for representation on shareholder-listed companies. In the mid-noughties, within 6 years, they've got to pretty much 45%. The sky has not fallen in. It ain't going to happen with, yes, you can do partners for change. You can do a lot of that stuff. I think that's great. But the reality is we now need targets. It's not going to happen. There's a great article I've put out. It's on your table. And Helen Zoki, who was the former Race Discrimination Commissioner, said at current rates, equal pay for women and representation will take 75 years. Okay, it's not going to happen. So trust me. As I said, I started my career in the early 90s. While there have been enormous gains, I don't want to be all doom and gloom, because absolutely not. LGBT has been talked about. There's much more sophisticated conversation around race. So there have been enormous gains. But if you look at representation at senior levels, it really very little has changed over 20 years. Disability employment's gone backward. So, targets is the way to go. Not enough good women, so we say research and screen, etc. And then you put forward good women, and there's a reason why we can't recruit. And the time will heal all. So quick table discussion. So as I said, I wanted to make this interactive. So for 2 to 3 minutes, talk about how any of those deadly myths, a personal example, or you might want to unpack that for yourself and share with the table, or how you see it playing out in the academy or your organization. So go, 3 minutes to pick one of the myths and unpack. Okay, I'm so used to doing that. Yeah. The mic is actually okay. If it's at this number, we can do the professional. I have a lot. Yeah, exactly. It's going okay?
Yes, super.
The research comes from
Okay, so 1 minute more to wrap it up.
I think that's because we're looking at the universe.
Yes. Projects.
Yeah. It's not that the universe is research going on for something. The country research is going to be able to start. How are you doing? Maybe
Okay, folks.
these are all myths. These are all myths. But I think the myths sometimes just come.
Okay, always a good sign when there's a buzz in the room. And no one's checking their mobile phone, so that's great. Those are my metrics. Okay, so the education is a gender paradigm. I'm sure your sector is as well. So what do? We reproduce professional habit. So if you look at universities, they were established largely on patriarchal foundations. So the all four quadrants, the conversation, the architecture, the narratives in the organization are essentially imbued with masculinity and male privilege, okay? So unless you interrogate, unless men and women become conscious around that, it's not going to change. The softer competencies are often given to women, and that has career implications. The previous speakers have touched on that. Lack of gender competence, we need to have this conversation, okay? Achieving life balance challenges, that's still problematic. As an equal opportunity practitioner, every 2 months I get a staff member coming to me saying, my manager will not allow me to return from parental leave in my previous role. So they either demand they take a drop in salary, often illegal under the Fair Work Act, or the position is not divisible, when the Fair Work clearly says, if not, why not? So we're still facing this challenge. The leaky pipeline effect, the fundamental premise that we'll get a lot of women through A and B, they'll automatically make it to the professoriate, has not occurred. And Amanda Sinclair talks about this, the culture in that quadrant being of heroic leadership. So what's valued? So heroism, physical toughness, emotional toughness, and self-reliance. Okay, that's what's considered valuable. That dominates the culture of senior management. A lot of women look at that and go, nah, don't want to go there. And how does it act out? Very long working hours. We literally have heroic stories. It was funny, someone very senior about 10 years ago at UWA launched the work-life balance policy, and then the office had a semi-humorous comment made to us privately that the very next day he came in on Monday and said, I worked all weekend, and he applauded two of his senior male staff who came in on the Sunday. So what was the message being sent out? Rarely taking leave, travel at short notice, an interest in sport and social rituals. Amanda pointed out a lot of the women said, while the blokes would not obviously exclude, the conversation invariably at Friday drinks or at the club ended up being around sport and masculine physical achievement. And often women remove themselves from the conversation. That look familiar? Yeah? And the rules of individualism. So, no sissy stuff, be a big wheel, get sturdy up, and give them hell. Okay? So that's the very Napoleonic style of leadership, and we currently see it not too far away from here, actually. Not that I want to be party political. So wrapping up with the glass ceiling, it remains entrenched, and it is based on a narrow definition of merit, assessment of workforce flexibility, checkered career paths, what the research also shows. Women often, when a male partner gets a promotion and is transferred, in the majority of cases, the woman moves for her male partner rather than the other way around. So a loss in career, loss in seniority, loss in professional networks, etc. Unfair emphasis on women's looks, relationships, families, cultural fit, etc. So now doing the internal piece on male privilege. So in your handout, on page, so the fourth and fifth page, is the male privilege checklist. So what I'd like you to do is, for a couple of minutes, just quickly have a read through the checklist, and then I'd like you to pick one or two and discuss it at your tables. And then we'll have a roving mic, and we'll just take feedback from maybe 3 tables. So a couple of minutes to read, unpack 1 or 2, and then we'll have a roving mic. Okay, so moving to courageous conversations. I should come down.
Yes.
This,
But it's another presentation.
okay, so
Which one?
second.
This one. Okay. Cool. And then just yeah, here. Awesome. Super. Yeah, goodbye.
Okay, now a couple of minutes to have the conversation. Yeah, just one or two. Yeah. That you connected with or great buzz.
Yes.
No. Hey. I love these photographs. I'll post you there. You've got to get a good one.
Water?
Thank you. Okay, folks. All right. So in the interest of equity, can I ask for 2 enthusiastic female volunteers and 2 male volunteers? Now, a couple of people at the back said they found it really hard in the morning sessions, and I was sitting at the back, I couldn't hear a thing. So can you please wait? There are 2 roving mics. So the 4 volunteers, can you put your hand up and wait till the mic comes to you? So who's going to go first? So you're picking any item on the, great, thank you. You're picking any item on the checklist and talking to it.
Where is it?
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk about number 22. This, apologies, this mostly applies to the United States because that's about the best. My sister was recently engaged, and we're looking to, her and her fiance are looking to move. So when she goes to a job interview, she had to take off her engagement ring because they see the engagement ring as somebody who's going to have children soon, therefore maternity leave and not an ideal candidate. Whereas her fiance took his wedding band and put it on before they were married because they saw that as, well, great, you're going to be starting a family, you're going to be settling down, you're responsible, and I think that's just totally true.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Yep. Next door.
All right, so I'm going to speak to number 8. When I asked to see the person in charge, odds are it's basically the person of my own sex. So this relates to some events that may seem mundane, but I don't think so. When I was an undergraduate, I majored in math. And the thing about a major, right, it'll be true of any major, is that there's a list of requirements. But a lot of people switch majors and then end up maybe not taking exactly the same classes, maybe slightly different classes sometimes. And when that happens, you have to fill in some forms to request a modification of the rules. Maybe you took a slightly different version of vector calculus. And I saw that as a formality. I had taken, because I switched from engineering to math, I had taken modified versions of differential equations and vector calculus, and that was fine. And then a couple of years later, I noticed a correlation, which was that for my male classmates who had made similar requests, all of them had it approved, but for my female classmates who had made similar requests, all of them had it declined, and then they would often have to waste time. They ended up taking the same class twice, basically. If it had just been 2 of us, I didn't think it ties into number 8, but there were at least like 5 or 6 of us. So that's a pretty strong correlation.
Right. Fantastic. Okay, 2 more. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to speak to number 18. Specifically the second sentence, which is, I can be aggressive with no fear of being called a bitch. So as a woman, and also just personal experience, in the past couple of months I've had to manage a large group of people for the first time in my life. And I'm still a PhD student, so this was intimidating to begin with. But I've actually, every time I send out an email to this group that I manage, I have somebody else in the office read it before I send it out to make sure that it's appropriate language, that it's not aggressive language, that it's polite, just because I do know that it's possible in our field that if somebody reads my email saying, you need to get this to me immediately, I could be labeled as bossy or aggressive, and I was having checked before I sent.
And that piece gets layered if you are lesbian. Often gay women in the workplace say that when things are going fine, it's okay. The minute they make tough decisions, it becomes she's lesbian and she's out to get men, she's out to get us, etc., etc. So it becomes even more intensified. Yep. And a final male. a courageous man. Great at the back.
Okay, I'll talk about number 16.
Mm-hmm.
You know, me. So just put a shirt. And I had a wife who was actually still have it. She's not working. She was working at quite kind of positions where I would say, "Oh, you're very power suited to that," because it actually did go whether she was in fact what the dress was, and in fact, particularly out actually.
And there's been some modeling done against number 16. It's actually thousands of dollars more. We're not talking hundreds. It's particularly the more senior you are. So, there's a significant impact. So I'm going to close on that and draw your attention to number 29, and that's the powerful one, which is I have the privilege of being unaware of my male privilege. So the point that I always make as a practitioner is, yes, you're going to get a bit of structural change and cultural change. But if the majority of men and women in the organization are not clear or don't get this piece, you're not going to have enough of a driver for change. So that's why this is such a critical piece. Okay, so moving on to the second one, which is courageous conversations about race. I'm giving you a one-day deep workshop in 25 minutes. So it's like one of the Shinkansen bullet train experiences. So Graham Innes talks about at the Canberra Press Gallery before Dr. Tim Supamasane. He says, Australia says, I'm not racist, but, and you can bet your bottom dollar something racist is going to follow. We are in zero acknowledgement, not zero tolerance. Okay, so the Malidali article talks about soldier here, and we just went, oh, you know what, bit of light Aussie banter. The hey, it's Saturday blackface's experience when Harry Connick Jr. said, whoa, in America you would be lynched. The Aussies went, oh, go back to the US, you bloody yank, don't tell us what to do, etc., etc., etc. So we don't acknowledge it's not an issue of zero tolerance, okay? The Malidali piece touches on that as well. So most organizations stick in the cultural awareness diversity approach. So how many of those of you have done some form of cultural awareness training? Yeah, quite a few. Okay, so you would have done Indigenous cultural awareness, or if you're going on a mission to China or Japan, you get a quick and dirty how to do business with Chinese, how to do business with Japanese, and away you go. The second one is the business case. So arguing for cultural competence it makes good business sense, and it does. There's a compelling argument for the business case. The problem with most Australian organizations, they've not looked at the human rights case for cultural competence. They focus solely on the business case. And check and comply is the checklist. So we have multicultural lunches, we do X, Y, and Z, but let's not look at the big picture. Is the organization culturally competent? Is it representative? And for the most part, they're not. So the key traps we fall into, it doesn't exist. It's not an issue. We've got the United Nations here. Look at how culturally diverse we are. Everyone's happy. We've got an Aboriginal employment strategy. Tick. We have multicultural lunches. We merchandise diversity. We fly international flags. So we've done our bit. We work interminably on anti-racism policies and cross-cultural policies, etc. And we need gap research. So what are the issues? We know what the issues are. You don't need any more. Of course you need research, but you know what I mean. You need action. And we want to take in cultural awareness. So cultural competence says, how do you get personal, social, and ethical awareness in an international context? So how do you look at, say, if you're working in Central and South America, how do you understand your position as an Australian in that context? Whether you're Caucasian Australian, whether you're Indian Australian, whether you're Vietnamese Australian, and what are the variables that may be playing out? How does white privilege translate internationally? I was doing a course a couple of months ago, and a white staff member at DWA said, Nathan, I totally get it. I traveled in Vietnam and India, and initially it was fun, but then it got annoying, and I absolutely get it when it got annoying. She said that the Vietnamese and Indians would go, beautiful white skin, blonde hair, la 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 la. I mean, absolutely, I'm not invalidating your experience of irritation, but your experience is very different to a dark-skinned Somalian woman in Western Sydney. Okay, it's qualitatively different. So that's the piece you need to get. The second piece is what are the differences within, among, and between. So I'm Asian, Renu's Asian, Min's Asian, but we're different kinds of Asian. And within Asian, there are layers. So Renu was the oldest when she arrived. I was late teens, and you came to Australia when you were about 7. So different layers of the experience, okay? So how do you account for that? Rather, I had, I do a lot of work in the residential colleges, and I had a very clued up white guy who attended the session and said, you know, we play basketball, and it's about 40% Caucasian, 30% overseas-born Asian, Australian-born Asian, or Australian-raised Asian, and 30% recently arrived international students. And they're always making fun of the Singaporean, Malaysian accent. So they're talking Minglish and Singlish. And he said, everyone laughs. So he said, that's not. I said, well, it's a matter of perspective. That 30% first-generation students may well be not finding it very funny after their accents constantly imitated. They may well be climbing up in their tutorials and lectures and getting very highly self-conscious around a Singaporean, Malaysian, or Vietnamese English accent. So you need to be very careful that you don't collude as a young white male with second-generation Asian immigrants who've largely flown under the radar because, you know, Australia, we had a white Australia policy for most of the 20th century. We're only now having this conversation. So you need to be very careful about how that impact is playing out. And let's look at power. Because Irish, Scottish, American, Canadian accents, yes, we may poke fun at them, but for the most part, they're in positive attribution. Malaysian, Sri Lankan, Somalian, and other accents are for the most part not so favorably viewed. Okay, so it's a qualitative difference. And how do you then promote cultural diversity into professional practice? Those three lead to a higher level of racial consciousness. So you can either go into, it's got nothing to do with race, colorblind, or you can take a layered reading of a situation. So courageous conversations about race, essentially, so Australian, race in contemporary Australia, complex story, you know, invasion, 1788, a very problematic Indigenous colonial history, the White Australia policy pretty much to the mid-70s, the Vic and Mabo, the Hanson One Nation debate, and now the charming senator from Tasmania, Jackie Lambie, taking on where Pauline Hanson left off. So, complex story. Do we get how that story has shaped the national psyche? As to why we don't talk about race, why there's a stain on the national psyche around First Nation people and a problematic engagement with accent in Asia. And Stephen May argues Australia is very much in romantic multiculturalism. So we've done tandoori chicken, Thai green curry, didgeridoos, going to Bali and Fiji, no problem at all. We've embraced that with gusto. What we haven't done quite so well is race and power. So if you look at Aboriginal life expectancy, 16 to 20 years lower. You look at the group of 8 senior structure, no culturally diverse or Aboriginal representation. Certainly in my university, it goes 4 deep. So we've got the Dean of Arts is a woman of colour, but no PVC, DVC, SDVC, obviously VC, and the other 8 deans are all, so it's a very monocultural tier 1 to 5 at UWA, and I suspect your organizations as well. We have one of the whitest parliaments in the Western world, and visible diversity is invisible. So a very senior male, you see Professor Bill Loudon, who was our senior deputy vice chancellor, attended my courageous conversations and said he'd been through gender equity in the 80s, 90s, and noughties, and he was very attuned. So he'd go to a senior meeting and go 2 blokes, 1 woman. But he said I never did a racial reading. So I'd go to senior meetings and never noticed we were all white. So visible diversity in an Australian context is all about invisible as well. Okay? So courageous conversation talks about 3 critical factors. It said you need to understand the national landscape of race. So that's the WiA2014 article. That's the bamboo ceiling. What's really happening? So you're not going into the simplistic binary of we're harmonious, we're happy, everyone's happy, we're a wonderful experiment. We are. A lot to celebrate. But also talk about what's not so good and how can we make it better. So you're getting race at that level. The heart is Min's story and the racial narratives that you went through. So how do you get unique slices on a second-generation refugee Vietnamese Australian experience, Muslim Australian experience, an Aboriginal African-American experience, an African-American experience, and a white experience. So in modern contemporary Australia, how do you get insights into multiracial experiences? And then the hands is then you go back to your organizations and you work to create culturally inclusive places. Okay? So Courageous Conversations offers a framework to do that. I'm just going to very quickly scoot through it. So the framework is on page 6. So it starts off, this is a one-day course, so I'm condensing. So it starts off with 4 walls. The first wall is remaining connected. So if you've got a racial issue at hand, you've got to have a difficult conversation, race-based. Stay connected to the issue. Honesty is the best policy. So we have to actually be honest. So in that example, with the head of school, sliding doors, had she come back to me and said, hey Malcolm, I just want to check, were you calling me, were you implying that I was racist because you raised these various, you gave me a racial analysis of a workplace situation. Are you implying that I'm racist? Or are you just furthering insight? So that did not happen. There wasn't the honesty. Discomfort is okay. Some of these conversations are going to be very uncomfortable, okay? But you've got to work through it if you're going to go to authenticity. Otherwise, you remain inauthentic. And it's a marathon, not a sprint. You're not going to get it always. Sometimes you're going to go through a very convoluted race-based organizational issue or a racial harassment complaint if you're a senior staff member, and it's icky and messy. It may never be resolved, okay? And that's okay as well, all right? So that's the 4 walls. So once you've got your 4 walls, how do you then determine what's to be talked about? So how are you clear about this area? So the first condition is keeping the spotlight on race. So race basically, I'll give you a minute to read page 7. So when I do the one-day session, I put on the board to what extent does my race impact my life. For the most part, Caucasian Australians put 0, 10, 20%. Immigrants generally put 70s, 80s. Aboriginal people often put 100%. The answer is 100%. Because when I sold the program to executive at UWA, a senior white guy, he put down 0%. And he said, I went to a very prestigious school in Perth, then went to the UWA Law School, then got a great job at St. George's Terrace. Someone at UWA tapped me on my shoulder who was a Guildford grammar, and the doors opened. So his white race had opened doors and impacted his life 100% of the time. Okay, so race is impacting our life 100% of the time. There was a great piece, either the VC or the DVC at the University of Chicago, Asian American woman, been there for 3 generations. So she took a tough decision, and she said, you know, she hadn't had a lot of racism through her career, but she took a tough decision to keep the university open. It was a very cold day, as you know, it does in Chicago in winter. And she said within half an hour there were blogs saying Asian bitch, etc., etc. So her Asianness got dragged out. Okay, so even though she was 3rd generation Asian American, the Asianness ultimately got dragged out. So race is impacting, even though she was at the top of the tree, race was impacting. So on page 8 is the language of race. So these are the common detours we engage in. So I'm going to, given it's the graveyard slot, I'm going to do this as like physical theater, okay? So if you've heard this one, I want you to stand up and then sit down. So you're going to get a bit of exercise. So if you're striving for racial equity, so remember you're having a courageous conversation. You've set the walls. Now you've got to determine what's to be talked about. So I might be having a conversation with Warwick, for example. He may well engage in one of these detours. So how do you then recognize and how do you then deflect? So the first detour, which we often hear. So if you've heard this, stand up. Color blindness. So people are just people. I don't see color. We're all human. Now, are you Indian? You're just a person to me. Yeah. Okay. Sit down. All right. The next one. Everyone should be treated equally and judged solely on the basis of merit. It's got nothing to do with race. A nice little aerobic session. Okay. This one's a really good one. Migrants and Aboriginal people are just as racist as Caucasians. The playing field is now level, and white people are being discriminated against. Okay, the next one. Oh, look, it's their fault. There just aren't many skilled migrants and Aboriginal people. They always use racism as an excuse, and they don't take responsibility. Okay, the Avon being cosmetic. We follow the checklist scrupulously. Look at the various achievements we've done on racial equity. I don't like being around Pauline Hanson, Caucasians, etc. So you do a bit of checklisty stuff. Yep, some of you. Yeah. Okay. Oh, you people are just too sensitive. I didn't mean anything racist. It was just a joke. Yeah. Why should I accept responsibility for past mistakes? I wasn't even born. Yeah. If you're fatigued, you don't have to stand up. But what about me? Look at how I've been hurt by sexism, classism, homophobia, etc. Yeah. So absolutely, that's a valid point, but you don't deflect from race. That's what the issue is. We have overcome. Look at the enormous achievements. We've got Aboriginal representatives in Parliament. We've got Barack Obama. We've got a few loose ends to tie. But we're post-race. It's a thing of the past. Yeah. This is a beauty. I'm not racist. My best friend is Chinese. My in-laws are Vietnamese. I attend rallies. I have a degree. Yeah, you know that one. You know I lecture in post-colonial studies. That was a real case. I lecture into the Foundations of Teaching and Learning. I'm sure you've got a similar program at AAB. So early career academics. And there was a young white guy, very problematic race politics. And I thought, oh. And I made an assumption, and my apologies to you about your sector as a social scientist, I made an assumption that he was engineering on one of the STEM faculties. It ended up that he was tutoring in post-colonial studies and arts. It was really, really problematic. So it's the only time I've gone from a session to the head of school. And she was absolutely delighted, the head of English. She said to me, she'd already had 3 complaints from Black South African and 2 Aboriginal students that they felt culturally unsafe in his classroom. So we might laugh at that, but just because you're in post-colonial studies or you're a researcher or you work at the Equal Opportunity Commission does not mean you get race. Okay, this one. I so identify with your people. I'm sure I must have been Chinese, Vietnamese, Aboriginal in a previous life. Okay. And the last one, if I'm Caucasian, I must agree with you if you're an immigrant or Aboriginal, because if I don't agree with you, I'll be called racist. So yeah, and white people sometimes do that, which is sad. And that's a whole problematic in another area in and of itself. So the first area is keeping the spotlight on race. On page 9 and 10 is the language. I'll give you a minute to just quickly go through the language. It's really important we get the language. And the important one is on page 10, the bit that's bolded, the third last paragraph, on systemic racism. So important to get the distinction between individual and systemic racism. So I can obviously be prejudiced. So Warwick, I don't like you because you're white, or Malcolm, I don't like you because you're Indian. That's the individual prejudice. But in order for a systemic racist act to occur, there aren't enough people who look like me. I don't have the presence, power, and preponderance in the system to change the lived reality for Caucasian Australians. Okay, so systemic racism is prejudice plus power. So really important to remember the difference between individual racism and systemic racism. And just going through racial identity, corner, culture, and color. Corner was Min's point about where are you from point. The bottom line is if you're on an Australian passport or you're a permanent resident, you're Australian. It doesn't matter what you look like. And regrettably, we're often asked those questions. And you know, like you, I don't mind. I'm very happy to answer it. The issue, though, becomes a couple of years ago, someone senior said to me, Malcolm, we've got too many Asians in medicine and dentistry. So that's where it becomes problematic. So I had to say, well, and this was a man of significant power. He was an executive at UWA, has since retired, but it was a very limited analysis. So basically, I had to respectfully say, well, actually, 95% of those Asian Australians in the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry are Australian born or have Australian PR, so they're Australian. So it was the positioning, it was the lens, okay, and the view. The second one is culture, which is about your consciousness. So how do you express yourself? So you can't point to people and say, oh, Min, you're Australian, or you can't be, or you're Vietnamese, or you can't be Vietnamese Australian, or we said Aboriginal people all the time. Or I think, or they're very pale skinned, they're only 1/10 Aboriginal, or they're half caste, or they're quarter Aboriginal. Do not do the fraction game, okay? You're either Aboriginal or you're not. It's got nothing, you can be as dark as me or as pale as Warwick, okay? And everything in between. So the fraction game, I can be Indian, I can be Australian, I can be Indian Australian or Australian Indian. So psychological identification and racial identity is a very personal process, and it can change. And color is race. So obviously, not saying that Caucasian Americans, Canadians, Swedes, Germans, New Zealanders will not have issues. There are definitely settlement issues when Caucasians come to Australia from Western liberal democracies, absolutely. But quite different to those of, say, Eastern Europeans, where English may not be the first language. Again, quite different to people of color like myself, but I went to a British school in Bombay, so English was my first language. And then again, very different to recently arrived Somalians and Iraqis, Afghanis, where English may not be the first language, and they're dark skinned as well. Okay, so really important to remember the color line and how the three interact. The second condition, it relates to connecting through your story. I'm not going to go to the stories, we're running out of time. But essentially what I wanted to do is pick the 5 stories. Ebony, Glenn, Tara, Ainsley, and Christine. You've been a very diligent group, and I know you've all done your reading. So what I was going to do in the exercise was an aha moment, or a couple of aha moments, or insights that you gained on reading them. Okay, so that was to be the exercise. Is there a conference dinner and drinks tonight?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Can I ask you to please do that over conference dinner and drinks? Okay, if you remember. So the second condition says, you've got to look at your own story. We often say, oh, Malcolm, you're exotic, or Min, you're exotic, you've got culture, I'm just boring white Australian. That's so wrong, because we all have culture, okay? So what is your racial story? How have you developed a position of on race? What are your filters? What are your lenses? And once you're clear about your racial story, you can then move to a level of proficiency in reading an intercultural situation. Okay? But if you don't know your story first, but you put Min and Renu and me in the other category, then you're missing the point. Okay? The third one is make complexity a friend, and that's quite simply the Gilad gray space. Okay? And with I've got a couple of slides these are not about stereotyping. These are what I call cultural patterns. It's very likely cultures will demonstrate these patterns. So as a general rule, blue represents Western countries, red represents many Asian countries, many Aboriginal cultures, in fact, etc. So these are shades. These are the way things are likely to appear. So an opinion, expressed in the Western sense, linear, logical, we often say when chairing meetings, get to the point. For many other cultures, the process is a very different one. You told me to use that. The way of life, individual versus community. Punctuality is I can say it for my own culture, does not value punctuality. Contacts, and that's a really useful one. There was a dilemma recently in HR, so an Aboriginal research position, looking at a particular town in southwestern Australia. The reality is the people on the selection committee would have been related to some of the applicants because it was a very, very small Indigenous community. So HR policy 101 says thou shalt not be related. So that's a very much a Western system where we have discrete groups. In the other system with Aboriginal families or my own culture, our Bollywood weddings, a Bollywood wedding is like 300 and it's a small wedding. So we're, your first cousin, second cousin, third cousin, fourth cousin on both sides. So very different in that regard. Anger and strong emotions. Again, generally, not always. Westerners tend to be more direct around expression and assertive. People from other cultures you often find in mixed race groups, Caucasians will talk first, will have more airtime in discussion rather than many Asian and many Aboriginal people. Q when waiting. The handling of problems, again, direct versus, and again, real implications for clinical psychologists in terms of working with Asian couples, and high power distance. Okay, so multiple perspectives. And the last condition is understanding white privilege. So similar to male privilege on page 12, there is an exercise on white privilege. So I'm happy for you to stay in your role, or alternatively, you may want to take on the role of a darker skinned Aboriginal person, a recently arrived Iraqi or Afghani, maybe with a hijab or burqa living in Auburn or Lakemba, or a Chinese Australian person, been here 10 years, speaks fluent English but has an accent. So on a day-to-day basis, am I likely, depending on your racial role, to enjoy those conditions? If you can be absolutely certain you're going to enjoy it, it's a yes. If you've even got a 1% doubt, maybe not, it's a no. Okay? So quickly take the white privilege checklist. And again, can I have 2 or 3 volunteers? Hopefully you pick different racial groups. What's the pattern? Mainly yeses, mainly nos? How's it working for you? In a couple of minutes. And we'll have a roving mark. Okay, let's say 3 volunteers, and hopefully we'll get a bit of a racial mix. Who'd like to go first? Excellent. So stating your racial role and how many yeses, how many nos.
So in between black and white, I'm in the not gray area, but olive skin area, where it's very difficult for people to put me in the box very often, because as you yourself have English as your first language. My first language is English, kind of unbelievable, because I was almost born in the US, but when then we returned to Greece where I grew up afterwards. So many things that I know on this list that really, I love that it's not a race issue exactly, because as per the definition of the previous page, you mentioned white, it includes the whole spectrum.
Correct.
Through down to Mediterranean. It definitely doesn't feel that way when I go back here, especially right now. There are so many things that I do on an everyday basis that will be attributed back to being Greek. And there's one that what a big fat no on is, can you perform well in a challenging task without being told you're credit to your race? Oh boy. I mean, I never did anything good. This is not immediately at work, because people are, obviously the astronomers are very good at these things. But in general, if I do something that isn't, it just surprises anybody to do anything right. It's just like, oh wow, you don't sound Greek, you don't act. What is that? It's like, well, I don't know, what is that?
So do you have mainly yeses or nos, or?
I have 7 yeses and everything else.
Okay. So do you think that, say, your experience in an average Australian city, average Australian town, if a darker skinned Aboriginal person or a Sri Lankan person or a Somalian Muslim was filling that out, do you think that you would likely have the same nose as them, or you'd have less nose?
I probably have fewer nose.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Excellent. Okay. Can we have somebody else?
Similar,
Yeah.
So my parents arrived from, Hungary in the 1960s, early 1960s. And there were a lot of articles in the newspaper about Hungarians that used to be repainted with bag and steel. And so I think it's so good looking at one of the things, number 14, the local paper. Can you be sure you'll read a positive story? Just not maybe now after you paper will find, but certainly Australia has gone through periods where migrants were like places that you see a lot of racism. And still today, you're from Romania, you know, are you sure you want to read the paper and read a story about these working Romanians? So I think it's still out there.
It's a matter of absolutely, and the Italians and Greeks were not treated very well in the 50s, absolutely. So it's out there. It's a matter of degree. Yeah. Okay. The point with you is it's that notion of passing. So even say if you were Hungary-born with a strong Hungarian accent, you would have had settlement issues when you open your mouth. But if you were on a train or if you were in a shop, it's very unlikely you would have been pulled over like many darker-skinned Aboriginal people, based solely on how you look. That's what the privilege exercise goes to. You'd have far lesser no's compared to any of the three other groups that I talked about earlier. Okay, and can we have one final person?
Yeah, so I have a microphone. Should I go or
you go and then, but I would also like a diverse voice. Yeah. So you go first.
Okay,
Yes.
I was actually going to say something which is to put myself in the position of Chinese Australian, bizarre as that sounds.
Mm-hmm.
I have a teenage son who goes to a selected high school in Sydney.
Mm-hmm.
He's 93% non-Indigenous background. All the boys there are Australian because he had to be there. But it's the case that our son is now a physical minority in that school. We made many friends, both his friends and his friends and parents who are Asian Australians. Fantastic group of people, but it means we have a lot more conversations around race in our house than we do otherwise. So it's an area of fascinating. Really enjoy the men's talk, and in fact, our son came out with kind of outrage just a few weeks ago. A team that he was in his school was sponsored by a community organisation. They were invited to dinner to meet the people who were sponsoring them. And the Vietnamese Australian boy on the team was the only one who was asked exactly the same questions: where were you from?
Yeah.
The other boys in the team said, I have lunch, they came back to school and said, we actually don't know what student came from and this time, so it'd be something. They felt there was so much systemic racism.
Yeah, our schools are not even beginning. This conversation's going through US schools like wildfire. It's a US model that I've adapted. It's not even begun in Australian schools. And your son's experience that's a really complex one, where you've got a Caucasian minority in a largely Asian Australian majority school. It can play out very differently. But there is a lot of research which shows even though you may be a Caucasian minority in a largely Asian Australian school, the Caucasian children will be overrepresented in leadership. So it's a bit like male professional staff. So preponderance of women, male professional staff, males float to the top. Similar. So make no mistake, white privilege can rise to the top even if the vast majority of fish in the pool are Asian Australian. Yes.
Thinking as a Chinese Australian, it's about 50-50 yes and no.
Look.
What struck me is exactly what is it five famous Chinese Australians now.
Yeah. And that's your experience backs up the research in this area. The Chinese Australian group taking this exercise will generally get 50-50 because so you might want to Google it later, they're called the model minority in the US at the moment. So the Hispanics, Latinos, African Americans, Native Americans are seen as the problem minorities because underrepresented in education, overrepresented in the criminal justice system, blah, blah, blah. The Asian Americans conversely are highly represented in education, high income. So for the most part, they support the Western way. So they're seen as the model minority. So many Asian Australians taking this exercise will get a 50-50. But what's happening now in the US, which is interesting, is Asian Australians there's a real political movement happening saying, so Oyan Pun is one of the researchers in this area at the University of, at Loyola University in Chicago. And she said she was given the name Olivia because her mom and dad said, oh, don't be Oyan because you will be slaughtered. No one wants to say Oyan Pun. So she became Olivia. And many Asian Americans are now reclaiming their Chineseness and their Chinese ethnicity. And they're growing. They were very racially disconnected because they wanted to be safe, be white, to get ahead. And they're now reclaiming their Chineseness and Chinese identity. So that's not happening in Australia. So the earlier conversation this morning, which was why I'm recapturing data in the immigrant group, I'm starting to do it at UWA, but it's a really problematic one because I was doing a session at La Trobe, and there was a very senior Sri Lankan male. He got to the top. And he said to me, Malcolm, you tell me, okay, I experience racism occasionally, but essentially I'm a PVC, I'm respected, I work hard, I drive a great car, my kids are happy, blah, 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 blah. For the most part, he's having a great life. Why should I engage with race? So then I gave him the reasons. It's about your authentic self. You may have had a dream run. There may be 5 other people from Sri Lankan and South Asian background who haven't, blah, 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 blah. But in Australia, it's going to take a fair while. I suspect when the bamboo ceiling momentum starts gathering in the next 5 to 7 years, we'll see much more of an Asian Australian political movement happening, which has happened in Canada and the US. It's a difficult conversation to have. Most of the Asian Australians in Australia are flying under the radar, very happy, and like, don't rock the boat, don't have that conversation, not going there. Yeah, okay.
Hi, I left Sri Lanka when I was 2.5 years old and basically grew up in New Zealand and came to Australia. So I guess my comments about this. With the interpersonal section, I said yes to everything. I can say I have never experienced any serious racism. So I guess maybe I'm lucky in that sense, or maybe it's just the design. I was happy about that. But then it came to the organization part. I should say yes to most of those, except for 6. So in undergrad, I tried to apply for some retail jobs and stuff like that. And generally, when I first meet people, like they won't judge me because they can see me, they can hear me, they can find out who I am. But when I was applying for these retail jobs and stuff like that, I thought that would be first, which is Rajika Karina. And I'll be like, she's probably not, cultured, she probably doesn't know fashion and stuff like that. So I had that in mind, but I didn't care too much about it. I eventually got a job. But I never really thought about the whole applying for a job with a not anybody.
You certainly wouldn't be. You'd have to agree you'd be a no in the 7 as well. How could you be a yes in 7? Did you say yes to 7? Or no to 7?
Oh, I said no, sorry.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Okay, right.
I am.
That's a no.
In the racial majority.
You are in the racial majority.
No, I'm not.
You're not. Yeah, that's a no. So, because you said you only had one yes in that and all. You only had one no and all the rest were yes.
Oh.
That's correct. Yeah. Okay. And in the social?
Social? I don't experience any racism.
No, I mean no, the last.
The social part?
Yes, societal, I should say. Yeah.
Didn't quite get to that in detail.
Okay, that's fine.
I can't name 5 famous Australian ethnicity,
Correct.
or even internationally, but
Yeah. Okay. So look, we're going to have. I'm sorry, we're running out of time. I really want to do 15 minutes for questions for Q&A because it's a really great session, and I think we're going to get some great questions. So, in the interest of LGBTI issues, I want to move to LGBTI issues and just close on race. So whiteness, it's a structure of power. It's not about skin color. And Rodriguez and Delgado, question we need to all ask ourselves. We're often oblivious as to what it means to be white and the extent to which whiteness dominates campus culture, organizational culture, making it uncomfortable for many people of color, culturally unsafe, and how do we examine and identify it. So moving on to the final area, so LGBTI. That was in the slide. So, I'm going to move to the next one. Okay, so while we're doing that, can I ask that people look at page 13? And again, just pick one aspect of privilege and tell a story to somebody next to you or share an experience. If you're LGBTI, you've got an LGBTI friend or father or brother or sister or whatever. So just getting a sense of privilege.
No, the first one. Okay. This one.
Yeah.
So where? This one?
No, the first one.
So this one. Okay, yeah.
Yep, that's it.
And where?
Awesome.
There? We'll go there? Okay.
Great.
Next time.
Thank you. Awesome. So just a couple of minutes. Do ask me a question. Okay. Quick conversation at your table. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so in the interest of time, two quick points of privilege that you picked up and unpacked. Any two people, very quickly. When did you want to tell your story? I just thought that was a really great story. Come up, have the mic. And I think, again, Lisa's fantastic presentation says it all. And I think stories like these, which talk about the lack of safety for LGBTI people. Oh, yeah.
So I must apologize. This is about me not understanding many things when I just arrived. And we had this very distinguished academic, and I used to regularly work with him. There was always a reference to partner. And I never knew that the partner was a male partner. And he was visiting India, and he came to me and said, very excited, he said, oh, I'm going to India. And my natural reaction was, oh, wow, your wife is going to love the saris, and you should see the food and color, buy the silks. And within a second of that conversation, I realized something was not right. And I just shut up, after that. And then I said, oh, I'm sure you like the food and this and that. And after we left, I got a bashing from my colleagues who actually were aware. And I cannot tell you how bad I felt for him and for myself. But then I thought a while, and I thought, should I let it go and plead my ignorance? But then I sent an email apologizing. I said, please, I never meant any kind of disrespect or anything. It's just my ignorance, so you have to forgive me. if you can. So, yeah. And I've never forgotten that. That was such an eye-opening experience and could have changed me permanently, probably.
Great, thank you. And that's very honest and related. And again, looking at the intersection of race and sexuality. So when my partner and I went the first trip to India about 10 years ago, it was extremely stressful. So with the going Catholic relatives, it was basically conservative Catholics. It was best friend. With all my hip school friends who were cool, it was boyfriend partner. So we were literally zigzagging across Bombay and Goa. And Chris was going, now am I best friend or partner? I'm going, best friend. So we were literally best friend at a breakfast, partner at lunch, best friend at dinner. It was extremely exhausting. So yeah, so which are heterosexual, so a white guy or a white woman with an Indian man or woman would just not have that layer of stress. Okay, one more observation. Yep. Oh, sorry, I thought you were going to say something. Anyone else? Great.
Hi, I'm Maggie Evans-Gale from the Murdoch Children's. I'm not an astronomer, I'm sorry. But something I was just sharing with these guys is we all go on postdoc overseas, and when I was in the US, we had a couple of Australian friends who came over roughly at the same time we did, and we were apartments above and below each other. And these two girls were very close roommates, and we could tell that something, was very special about the roommate relationship, and that was okay. It didn't bother us in any way. We just were friends, and we got on, and we all had a good time. And we spent a lot of time going to their house for dinner and everything. And anyway, these women were in their 30s. They had university, professional career for an extended period of time, and anyway, we were at their dinner over at their house for dinner one night, and they said to us, we've got something to tell you. We said, okay. It was really serious, we could tell it was very serious for them. And they said, we're gay, we're partners. And we said, yeah, okay. And that was the first time they'd come out. And we couldn't believe it. We felt so privileged to be the people that they told. And of course, we had to have them a celebration the following week, like a wedding celebration, because we had like presents, and we were just so excited for them. And then eventually, a few years later, when we had to farewell them, we got them T-shirts that were made in a rainbow colour that said 100% out. And it was just amazing to us that they hadn't even told their parents. They were too afraid to tell their parents. And it really brought home to my husband and I just how difficult it can be for some people who are in a minority group and face that kind of stigma.
Yeah, that's a really great story. Thank you for sharing that. So heterosexual privilege acts out in multiple ways. I think, again, go back to Lisa's talk, but other things we'll not hear the speculation. And we might laugh, literally, it was about a year ago, I had a female staff member ring me in a conspiratorial tone going, Malcolm, can I discuss something with you? And I went, yeah. She said, I've been asked out to lunch by a lady. And I went, so what's the problem? She goes, oh, I heard she's a lesbian. I went, so? And I said, well, if she says she's interested in you, then you just say, like you would to a heterosexual guy, look, happy to be friends, but not interested. So what's the big deal? So we might laugh, but there was speculation in that office that the person had not come out as to whether she was or she wasn't. Holding hands, fearing rejection, the third person in personal pronouns, that's the notion of what Lisa talked about, the partner. So if you don't want to come out, then you're constantly saying partner, they, I'm getting the sign from Renu, they, etc., rather than having to say he or she. So it's very stressful. And huge amount of transphobia in the workplace. About 70% of trans people have experienced direct transphobia in the workplace. Lower for LGBT, but still present. LGBT, but still present. And don't assume everyone's heterosexual or homosexual. Sexuality is a continuum. It's very grey. Very few people are either, Kinsey says, very few people are either hetero or homo. There are lots of shades in between. Many of us experience same-sex desire, and some act on it at different points in our lives. Sexuality is not the most important feature. We're not all experts on the subject. We don't want to talk about gay marriage anymore. GeoBDIP, don't assume we're attracted to you, and it's not about special rights, it's about equal rights, okay? I want to do one piece for just a minute, because otherwise Celine and the conference organizers are going to kill me and never invite me back. And that is the law and sex-based harassment. So in Australia, you have a range of federal instruments. So the Equal Opportunity, which is a different act now, it's the WGEA Act, WGEA Act, the RDA, the SDA, the DDA, and that's been enhanced. And every state has an equal opportunity instrument. So if you're in Western Australia, you invoke the West Australian Equal Opportunity Act. It is illegal to discriminate against on any of those 11 conditions. And we've just added gender history. So basically, if you're a trans person, you can't be discriminated against. And sex-based harassment, quite simply, says it can be broken down into 3 categories. So firstly, it can take these forms. So firstly, advances or demands for sexual favors that are unwelcome, unsolicited, and unreciprocated. So virtually every couple of months, often in the student body, you get the email and the texting harassment. So I'd have to go in with the head of school or the associate dean of student services and say, no, stop it, you can't do it. It's sexual jokes, remarks, screensavers, displaying of offensive, embarrassing, or insulting material on premises, nude comments about appearance, funny jokes. You really get some kind of, it was interesting, I was having, let's just say, somewhere in Canberra in the last day or two, having a meal, and one of the male waiters was really bordering on the nude comments, and he was running, as a EO practitioner, he was running a very close line with a young Asian Australian woman, and she was smiling and laughing, but it was really bordering very much into sexual harassment territory. Speculation about a person's private life and sexual activities, and threat of dismissal if favors are not received. The sexual harassment is largely what the law says, that even if you say, look, I was joking, I didn't mean anything, and I'm using she advisedly because 9 out of 10 is male, female, okay? It does go the other way, that's why I'm saying she. But it's about, the legislation says it's about effect, not intent. So if you as a bloke say, no, I didn't mean anything, but if the impact on, so a case I dealt with recently in the faculty was the young woman, she asked to change her lab room. She felt unsafe going to the car park because this guy had followed her into the car park on 2 occasions. She basically had to get, for about a month, her parents had to pick her up. So that it's about, had she progressed to the commission would have looked at the effect on her and the text messages, etc. Okay? So that's, in a nutshell, sex-based harassment. So if it's occurring, contact your university or your HR people, your equity and diversity advisor, or your equity and diversity office, or ring your commission or anti-discrimination commission in New South Wales, and I'm sure the ACT has a similar body. Okay, look, I'm going to end on that and just basically put up this slide, which talks about, I've lost it. It talks about inclusive cultures, and it says if everyone in the organization can feel validated, can feel worthy, and can reach their potential, and not have to leave themselves in the car parks, and not have to leave their South Asianness, or their trans identity, or their clinical depression in the car park, then you are building an inclusive culture within your organization. So can you actively say that you're doing that? Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure, as usual. It's been really great. I've really enjoyed it. Yeah, happy to take a few questions.
So Matthew is happy to take a few questions. We've just got probably time enough for 2 or 3 questions. Yes.
This is what I found. I'm probably going to ask this question.
I had my plans.
So one issue that comes up all the time is the issue of quotas. And people who are on the same page and everything else often disagree on quotas. Can you say that you believe in it? Can you indicate why and how long you may say?
Okay, so I prefer the term targets, but you know, much for muchness in some ways. I think the research has shown, so if you look at a longitudinal analysis from, say, late 80s, when equity and diversity offices began to be established, so for 25 years in say, let's just say gender, race, and disability, we've made limited progress. So you can conclusively demonstrate that in some areas we've actually gone backward, okay? So there's also research clearly indicating that unless you have targets, but accompanied by this sort of conversation, because just the problem with targets and quotas is you impose targets and quotas, the blokes get angry. So the blokes say, see, she was a mediocre woman. So if something happens and there's a mistake in program management, it's because she's a woman, okay? So you're setting the women or the people of color up to fail. So if an organization, it's ultimately about leadership. So if you are happy to say, well, there are over 24% of culturally and linguistically diverse Australians in the community and vast numbers on our campuses, yet they're completely absent from leadership, that becomes a human rights issue. So if you're happy to say, yep, they're all at level 9 and below, they're made to level D and E, but generally not D. If you're happy with that situation, then you've really got to question yourself as a university. But if you are prepared to be bold, and if you are prepared to show leadership, like Courageous Conversations about Race was a bold move by UWA, because most organizations talk cultural diversity, tolerance, acceptance, diversity, blah, blah, blah. No one names race. They're terrified of naming race. Okay, I never thought the program would get up. It got up, and it's now being rolled out across the country. You know, UWA is just, it's a flagship program. So my executives showed leadership. So you have got to show leadership. You've got to get your execs and some key people really absolutely clear around gender politics, race politics, sexuality politics. So when they get that person saying, oh, but what about me? I'm a bloke, or but what about me? I'm third generation Italian, etc., etc. Your senior person can go back and say, we absolutely accept that. But here are the statistics showing boom, 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 boom. We are a socially responsible leader. We will monitor and review. Yeah. So both targets, but the conversation.
So I've had friends, white male friends, say, oh, I didn't get a job, I didn't get a promotion, a fellowship, whatever, because there was a black woman who they gave it to. How do you suggest responding to something like that?
Look, well, go to condition 3, which is make complexity your friend. So the Gillard gray space. So it's about, depends on the friend, depends on the context. It's about saying there is a historical inequity. So if you look at the African American situation, you know, I don't need to tell you the story. And say it is important as a wider social policy goal that we have senior black people as role models. Okay, so Martina was important for you know, a young English girl. So that's what the issue is. So we need role models, but you also need to say you are probably making. I don't support quotas solely on identity categories. So just because you're black or just because you're gay, no. You've got to have skills, and if there may be, give or take, say, someone from the dominant group on paper, first past the post, but someone from a hugely underrepresented group, maybe not quite there, but very close, the selection committee could possibly consider affirmative appointment. So I'm not saying a huge gap, because then you're setting the person up to fail. But if it's relatively close, there is a case for affirmative appointment, in my view.
And I know that part of why I'm here, but you're talking to someone who is privileged to not be aware of their privilege for whatever reasons, it's hard to say, well, greater social values and we role models, et cetera, et cetera. How do you make it personal enough that they should want to support this promotion, even if it's to their detriment?
Well, stories and narratives. If you know of stories and narratives, I think they're really important. They're incredibly powerful. So, an African American friend of yours who Barack Obama was a fabulous Condoleezza Rice example of affirmative action. And look at the immense contribution both have made. So, personal stories and narratives, I think they're great.
One last question.
Yeah, I just a follow-up to that one. I'm going to share one line with someone I spoke to exactly the same situation 20 months ago. A friend of mine was behind me to a position of starting a party. I just came up, oh, yeah. And one of the men in the group said, oh, that's interesting, there are 43 academics in this department. 42 of the men, and maybe the woman was the one who was
Thank you very much.
So on that note, let us all join our hands to thank Malcolm Martin. Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you so much.
Okay. Judging by the applause, next year I won't come if it's not in Paris, Hong Kong, or New York.
Okay.
Just saying.